So much was revealed to us in week 1 of fantasy football. While everybody else is overreacting to the fantasy point numbers players scored, we're looking at the snap shares, where these players were actually used on field, and everything we need to know that makes them a real fantasy value on the waiver wire. I suggest you hit that subscribe button to stay on the right side of fantasy football information that'll lead you to a championship every single week. And while you do that, Hollywood Brown is going to be the number one easily ad of the week here. I left the number one defense at the end of this video, so make sure you stick around for that if you like to stream, because statistically, streaming defenses is the number one best way to outscore the top defenses, and you'll want to pick them up before your league mates do. But obviously, Xavier Worthy's dealing with an injury, dislocated shoulder. I'm sorry to say, but he has a real chance of missing the entire season if he has to go through surgery, let alone a couple months. Depending on where exactly the shoulder injury is, we will get more information on that as the week goes on, but it is definitely not just some light injury that can be walked off after a few weeks. And it is insane that Hollywood Brown was the absolute number one. He ran the most routes. He finished with the number one most targets and yards because of it. And his 40% target share from last week led him to have almost 20 fantasy points on the day against a pretty decent Chargers defense. They get a middle of the pack matchup in week 2 against the Eagles, and they follow that with the Giants in week 3 and the Ravens after that. So you can imagine we can be starting Hollywood Brown in these matchups. Now, will he get 16 targets again every single game? Absolutely not. A 40% target share is only for the elite of the elite. And even then, guys like Malik Neighbors, guys like Drake London, don't have a 40% target share every single week. But when you're tied to a quarterback like Patrick Mahomes, there's always going to be upside for you to be startable. And Mahomes was a top 5 quarterback in passing attempts last year. He had 39 last week. We can expect him to be around 35 passing attempts per game. But more importantly, Travis Kelce really did not have a huge role as far as target share goes, only 4 targets. It is one game. He's going to have better target share games out of that, but we've seen the Chiefs slightly take back his snap percentage over the past years because of his age. They use him when it's really important. Everywhere else is maybe not as much as before. So it looks like he is the safe, clear number one wide receiver as long as he stays healthy, because that has been his downfall for the longest time. Is he going to have 20 fantasy points every single week? No, but he can definitely be a flex startable guy for you without Xavier Worthy, who I think is going to be gone for a while. But honestly, the most popular waiver wire ad of this week is going to be Quentin Johnston. This is a guy that I would be a little bit more restrictive of. He has the highest boom bust potential on that scale than people think on this list. Obviously, he had a great game, 24.9 fantasy points on the Chiefs, which is a good defense. Most of that did come from his 2 touchdowns, though, on 5 receptions. That's an insane touchdown to catch ratio, but it's not unheard of for Quentin Johnston in the role that he plays in this offense. He was the wide receiver 6 in touchdown catch rate last year at 6%. And last year, he had his highest target rate per his route run against man coverage at 31.2%. That's wide receiver 27, so he's good against man. The Chiefs ran a good amount of man last week as well. And even without the touchdowns, he would have scored 12.9 fantasy points. So it was still a good game outside of that. But he doesn't need a crazy high target share to be relevant. He's one of these guys like a Rashid Shaheed, maybe even a Josh Downs. They don't need 12 targets a game. You can give them 4 go balls. They'll catch some of them and they'll be perfectly fine. So we do need to be real. Justin Herbert in this game did have 35 pass attempts. That would have been his 6th highest last season. It is more than likely that that will come back a little bit, especially as Omarion Hampton gets more acclimated to the NFL speed. But they also did add Keenan Allen back to this offense, who the last time he was on the Chargers, I believe in 2023, he was the wide receiver 3 in fantasy football points per game. He dropped 19.8 fantasy points on 10 targets last week alongside Ladd McConkey. Now they also have Trey Harris from the draft. He's dealing with a ton of dropping issues just like Quentin Johnston was as far as his target competition goes. So there is definitely some guys in there. Quentin Johnston is not the locked and loaded wide receiver 1. He's had his dropping issues. He started the last year the exact same way as this, and everybody was picking him off the waivers, and he was not a consistent startable guy. So just know that is definitely a possibility, but he does clearly play one of the starting roles. He played with the starters clearly last week, 82% of the snaps. That was more than Keenan Allen. That was way more than Trey Harris. So there is definitely potential here, which is why we're rostering him and stashing him on our bench just in case. His role is solidified for now as the field stretching guy, and they get a matchup against the Raiders in week 2. That's possibly a spot we can look to start him. He could honestly be a sleeper in week 3 against the Denver Broncos after that Raiders matchup, because Pat Surtain is going to be locking up Ladd McConkey. And if we look at last season, he only allowed Ladd to average 11 fantasy points per game in their 2 matchups last year. We just saw what he did to Calvin Ridley. You can take any single game from last year and see that Patrick Surtain holds wide receivers to absolute nothing. That could be a spot where we look to start him in a boom or bust potential kind of week. But if you have tight ends, There were so many that got injured last week. Brock Bowers had a knee injury. George Kittle out with a hamstring. Evan Ingram as well. If you're looking for a plug-and-play tight end or even to play defense on your other league mates and pick up one so they can't have them, Juwan Johnson is 100% a guy that you need. He was only behind Chris Olave in target share last week against the Cardinals. He finished with 15.6 fantasy points with 11 targets, good for 8 receptions and 76 yards. This isn't necessarily a fluke game from him. At the end of last season, when he played over 75% of the snaps, he averaged 8.5 targets, 13.3 fantasy points in those games. And that snap share will continue to happen as long as we have Taysom Hill and Foster Moreau both on the PUP list. They aren't going to be back for another 4 games at the bare minimum, and they don't have a solid timeline to return. So as long as those guys are out, Juwan Johnson is your starting tight end. Now, he isn't a long-term guy because of that. Once Taysom Hill comes back, he's probably going to be a sleeper that we can go through and pick up and should do that early. He is also likely the best quarterback that they have on this roster, so there is always a chance that he plays quarterback for an extended period of time. And because of the quarterback situation, it's so bad, a lot of people aren't looking at Juwan Johnson because of that reason. It actually does help a little bit because their average depth of target as a team is very, 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 very low. They'll throw a couple dots to Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed a couple times, but most of their work is in the intermediate game, which is why Alvin Kamara is so good in the dump-offs there. That is also Juwan Johnson's role in that part of the field, which is why he almost led the team in targets, and he is a pretty big red zone threat. He's 6'4". They use him in that area of the field a lot. And they get a matchup against the 49ers in week 2, which is a neutral one, a little bit tough, so you can look to start him there as well. But another tight end you do need if you want to fill in season long, a guy that I'm stashing and holding for the longest, is Brenton Strange. He finished last week with 9.9 fantasy points, catching all 4 of his targets for 59 yards, leading the team in receiving yards, I might add, with Brian Thomas, with Travis Hunter in their win over the Panthers. Now, we do have to be fair. The Panthers defense is one of the best fantasy defenses for allowing points, allowing yardage to opposing wide receivers in pretty much every single position. So you do have to take that into account. But in the games last season when Evan Ingram was out and not playing, Brenton Strange averaged over 10 fantasy points per game. So it's not like this is a complete fluke. He dominated in routes run compared to the other tight ends on this team. He's clearly the number 1. And they get an amazing matchup this week against the Bengals again, who allow top 3 points to opposing tight ends, allow top 3 yardage to opposing teams, wide receivers, success, quarterback, everything. They're very, very positive. So he's a guy that I can flex, plug, play, and start if I'm dealing with a tight end that has injuries. But if you're looking for a running back, which almost everybody is on these waiver wires, you need to pick up Trey Benson. The split between him and James Conner was a lot closer than we expected and what we wanted, because a lot of people were trying to speculate what this backfield situation would look like. We've heard a lot out of camp that James Conner is the RB1, but it is also possibly a 1A, 1B situation when we need him. Trey Benson finished with 8 carries for 61 yards and a reception compared to James Conner at 12 carries, 39 yards, and 4 receptions. You can see the efficiency difference here. Not like it was a really tough defense against the Saints, and it wasn't a blowout either. So James Conner did lead in snaps. He did lead in routes run as well, but it wasn't by a ton. But you look into the matchup they get in week 2. It's against the Panthers, who again are top 5 in every single fantasy point per game metric to the running backs. Everybody on the roster as well, but the running back specifically. It could be a massive game for whoever this RB1 is in this matchup. I expect it to be James Conner. He should be the lead back, but Trey Benson getting worked in here and there is definitely a good thing for guys that roster him. He could steal a touchdown. He could have a really big breakaway run. Again, the defense is really bad, so it's not impossible to do that. And after something like that happens, it's going to be impossible to get him off the waiver wire. You can probably sell him at a premiumer price. Premiumer, I don't know if that's a word, but it is today, to the guy that has James Conner because of that worry. So there's always injury risk with James Conner as well when we look at that. So that might be a move you're looking to make. But as promised, a few defenses here at the end of the video with amazing matchups. My number 1 must-add of this week is going to be the Rams, who get the Titans in week 2, who didn't look necessarily amazing against the Broncos defense. Now, granted, the Broncos might have the best defense in the NFL, but the Rams, when you look at them, they gave the Texans a lot of problems. They pressured CJ Stroud on over 40% of his dropbacks to exploit how bad that offensive line was. You can imagine they'll probably do the same thing about the Titans offensive line, who is not good, and Cam Ward, who is a rookie quarterback. They could get a decent amount of sacks on them as well. Cam Ward could turn the ball over. He didn't pass a ton, but that also kept them to a very low scoring total. So it's a great matchup for the Rams and a good solid defense on their own. Number 2, the Cardinals here, again, who get the matchup against the Panthers. They are top 5 in fantasy points allowed to the defense. Only only 1 sack last week against the Saints, which again isn't positive because the Saints offense is really, really bad and they only put up 5 fantasy points. This should be a spot where they bounce back. The Panthers didn't necessarily look amazing and they did invest their entire draft on defense, so they should be able to bounce back and put things together a little bit better. And you can also go out and grab the Cowboys, who get the Giants and Russell Wilson in week 2, who did not look good by any means. Now, granted, the Commanders' defense is pretty decent, but I'd like to think that the Cowboys' defense is about that level as well. They put up 10 points on the Giants last week. They had a good amount of sacks and turnovers. That's a possibility there for what we can see with the Cowboys. So you're going to want to go grab those guys and possibly the Bills defense versus the Jets as well. The Jets looked great last week. Can that continue? We know Justin Fields isn't necessarily new to turning the ball over, but that is going to finish this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you in the next one coming very soon. That will be the opposite of this video. Players you need to avoid off the waiver wire. I will see you in that one. Shout out to everybody watching this video. All glory to the man above.